Hi everybody and welcome to AP Economics with Mr. Farmer. Today we're talking about the long-run aggregate supply curve, equilibrium, and change to equilibrium for macroeconomics and ADAS models. So the main topics are demand pull and cost push inflation and how that impacts things like inflation, real GDP, unemployment. And then we're going to finish talking about how the long-run aggregate supply curve, the LRAS, can shift. So first off, let's make sure we got the graph down. So the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. Aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. And we're just going to say that we're not going to worry about the Keynesian, classical, intermediate, just upward sloping. The y-axis is price level, which we equate to consumer price index or price index. So we can use that to identify inflation. And then the x-axis is real domestic output or real GDP are the typical ones for that. So let's think about demand pull inflation. Let's do a little rundown scenario. What would happen if the economy was already at full employment? Just kind of think of what that would look like. And then, for some reason, consumers receive a lower tax rate. What would happen to that? Well, their disposable income would increase, and so they would start to purchase more things. Then purchasing more concepts or more things would then increase the inflation rate. This is because the price level is being pulled, hence demand pull, it's being pulled upward. The aggregate demand curve is shifting to the right. This would cause a positive GDP gap. Now, remember, the potential GDP occurs at full employment, at that LRAS. And so a shift away from that potential real GDP will cause these gaps. So this is what it looks like. So we start out at point A, and we have our LRAS, is this orange line right here. And then, because of the decrease in taxes, households consume more. So again, the aggregate demand curve is C plus I plus G plus the net exports. That equals GDP, and that equals the aggregate demand. So if households start to spend more, that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So what happens? Well, as we know, we said inflation is going to increase. Our price level increase. We can go back for just 1 second. Our price level was at PL, and now we're at PL1. So price level increased. Inflation increased. Again, the reason why I know is I can do PL1 minus PL. I can plug into the growth equation. Equals, it's going to be a positive inflation rate. There's an increase in real GDP. And because there's an increase in real GDP, there's a decrease in unemployment rates. Now, I notice that means that we're currently above full employment. Okay, or maybe we have negative cyclical unemployment, because again, full employment is when you have frictional and seasonal and structural. It does not include cyclical unemployment. So how can you be above full employment? You have negative cyclical. Now, what that actually means is you're probably pulling from some of that structural unemployment, or fewer people are moving out of their old jobs. So again, this is talked about in the expansion time period. Here's a business cycle here. So unemployment falls. Actual GDP is greater than potential GDP. Okay, so this is the expansionary time period, and that's what's depicted in this slide. So what do you think would happen in the long run? We're currently at point B. What would happen? We don't know of any external things happening. The government or the central bank hasn't done anything. So what would happen just in the long run? The aggregate supply curve would shift to the left. Okay, again, we call that self-adjustment. Now, why did this occur? Again, a reminder is that the aggregate supply shifts as resource prices, workers' wages, electricity, other resources, whatever else, adjust to inflation. Last time they're adjusted was down here at point A. But now, inflation's at point B, so all the real wages are currently decreased. So what's going to happen? All these people are going to say, hey, pay us more. And so that's going to naturally shift us back to our potential output. So this is the long-run equilibrium. It's not the same equilibrium because we were at point A, now we're at, let's just call that point C. So we have a new long-run equilibrium that we're talking about. Still the same output, but at a higher inflation rate. Now, does this happen? Well, here we go. Here's World War I. There's definitely a large increase in government spending, 1914, 15, 16, and the United States joins in 1917. You can see this is the first column is January through December. We're going to stay with January. It goes from 3% to 12% to 19%. Okay, there would be demand pull inflation as the government increases it. 17, and then 1920, 17%. Okay, so yes, this is what it looks like. So why did that happen? Increase in government spending, okay? Produced high levels of inflation. The actual GDP exceeded the potential GDP. We had a positive GDP gap here. Now we need to go back and talk about the multiplier and the multiplier effect back from chapter 8. If there is a GDP gap or something else, we have the thing where if the government starts to spend some money, we plug into that multiplier. Okay, we have an MPC of 0.6, then the multiplier would be 3. Okay, 1 over 1 minus 0.66. You plug into that and it's going to equal 3. So what this means is whatever the government does or whatever change to spending happens, it's going to be multiplied 3 times over. So let's say the government increases spending by just one little dot. Well, you notice there's 1, 2, 3. Why? There's a multiplier of 3. So it shifts all the way over. With that said, we now have the entire picture. Some of this multiplier, these 3 steps, is actually absorbed by inflation, which since we have the aggregate supply curve, we can actually see. So even though it had an absolute change of 3 times whatever it was, the reality as far as how much was actually produced, because inflation is only, let's say, 1.5 units. Why? Because some of this is absorbed by inflation. Okay, how about recession and cyclical unemployment? So what if we go from 82 down to 81? Okay, there's a decrease in production, there's a decrease in price level. Makes sense. Okay, we're going backwards. In actuality, and this depends on which aggregate supply curve you're using, deflation is actually really hard to come by. It can happen during unique circumstances, but it's more likely to have just very low inflation rates. Why so little? Well, it could be fear of price wars, think like mutual destruction. You don't want to start undercutting and undercutting and undercutting, because then what's the purpose of creating something? So if you go to like Keynesian economics, you talked about a thing called menu cost. The metaphor is that if you're running a restaurant and you have to start increasing the prices for all your plates, well, then you're going to have to take some time and estimate the length that's going to take place. How long are you going to cut the prices for? Reprice all the inventory, print and mail the new catalogs, whatever else. And by the time you're finally done, is it over? Is the deflation over? Maybe you just instead maintain your same prices, maybe lose some customers, but then you don't lose all the other stuff. Okay, it's harder to go up in price. It's better just to remain constant. There's other things also like wage contracts. You can break a contract. You can always go up. I don't think anybody would ever argue that. Okay, you can always pay more, but would a employee agree to less? Probably not. Even if they do, studies have been conducted on the morale. If you ask around, typically the response is, hey, I need to, out of my 100 workers, I have to save 1 salary. Okay, we can't make it work for a cyclical unemployment reason. Okay, we have a downturn in the economy. So I'll give you employees 2 options. Option 1, you can have 1 of the 100 people that work for me get fired. Option 2, you all take 1/100th of a dip in your paycheck. Typically the answer is fire the person. Why? It's just how it works, okay? And so we want to maintain those wage contracts. There's also like unemployment benefits, so that could be possible. There's also just minimum wages. At some point, I can't keep deflating. I can't keep lowering my prices because I run into costs that I can't absorb and I can't lower. This is why cyclical unemployment occurs, because of downturns in the economy and I can't do anything else. I can't lower costs anymore, so something has to give. That's why we have cyclical unemployment. So what does it look like? The question of deflation, again, this is typically when, what part of the aggregate supply curve are we talking about? This bottom part or this upper part? For the deflation and it not occurring, usually we're talking about, hey, you're in this section of the marketplace. Okay, and this is on the average, what's going to happen. Okay, for the new products, is there a decrease in those prices? Typically not. Okay, but this is what it's talking about. So where are you? Are you in the hyperinflation portion on this portion, what people call the classical portion? If you're in this part, then yes, you can get deflation. And you do see this. Okay, and we'll see an example of that later. Okay, how about cost push? So events occur that affect the aggregate supply curve. So aggregate supply is going to shift to the left from ASO to AS1. Price levels are going to increase. The quantity to produce decreases. We now have a negative GDP gap. My actual, right here, minus my potential is negative. Now here's the part. According to the aggregate supply, we're still kind of at full employment. What we mean by that is that they're still using all the resources they have available, just not all the resources are available. So the businesses will run at whatever they can. If they have 8 machines instead of 10 machines, they're still going to run those 8 machines at full capacity. But the reality is they should have 10. And so what we can say is that the economy has an excess capacity, kind of like the monopolist competition from first semester. There is an excess capacity. We're below full employment. We have some resources that are running idle. Okay. So even though the businesses feel like they're running at full employment because every resource that's there is doing 100% of their job, the reality is there's some people missing from this. There's a reason why we have this cyclical unemployment, that we have this creation going on here. So again, a little confusing on this statement. I want to kind of make sure I did clarify, because you hear this. Whoever's in this business right here, they feel like they're running at full capacity. The economy in general says, no, you can actually produce more. And whatever this gap is between here and here, that's what we call excess capacity. More likely to be used for the microeconomics, for monopolist competition, but you do occasionally hear it in the macro for this reason. Okay. And we can look at this. So in the 1980-82, during the Russian Revolution, there's an oil shortage, and so we saw prices going up in the United States. Because oil got more expensive, that was a supply shock to the system, and we definitely see that happening here. So what happened? There was a decrease in inflation, a decrease in real GDP, increase in unemployment, currently below full employment, positive cyclical unemployment. Now, typically, we would say this is happening. There's a decrease in inflation, increase in unemployment, everything else. But we didn't see that at this time. What did we see? We saw increase in unemployment because of lower output, but then we saw increase in inflation. Well, that's not what the other thing was talking about. This is because what happens is typically associated with the aggregate demand. The business cycle is based on the aggregate demand shifting around. We didn't have that. What we did have is stagflation. Stagflation is associated with an increase in inflation and at the same time an increase in unemployment. This is not the typical. And just like you see before, the business cycle doesn't deal with it. Macroeconomics, it has a hard time dealing with this, and we're going to see that as we start to go into fiscal policies, federal government policies, or banking policies. How do you deal with the stagflation? So again, there are some limitations even to the business cycle and what they talk about. So what do we notice after all this? Well, the aggregate supply and the aggregate demand can and have both shifted. So in order to increase the economy, to expand the economy, and expansion is going to be change in real GDP. We're talking about economic growth here. The typical is that we need to then increase the aggregate demand. But if we increase aggregate demand, inflation occurs. So that's why typically mild inflation is seen to be okay to have, because it shows a healthy economy. Now, too much is an issue. So here's a little practice scenario. So you're starting out at full employment, then there's an increase in household spending. See what you guys think will come up. So the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. Okay, shift to the right. What happens to the price level and real GDP? What do you think is going to be happening? Okay, so aggregate demand shifts to the right. Price level increase. Let's go ahead and mark this up here. Price level 1. What do you think has happened to unemployment levels? Unemployment would have decreased. What do you think is going to happen next in the long run? Since there's nothing else being tweaked, there's no changes in spending, whatever else, naturally, in the long run, the short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift over. Second practice scenario. There's a decrease in household spending. So that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve. What's happened to the price on real GDP? We're going to assume an upward sloping aggregate supply curve. We're not going to worry about is deflation going to occur or not. Okay, so we have a shift to the left of the aggregate demand curve. What do you think would happen to unemployment levels? Unemployment would have increased since we're now producing a lower amount. What happened next in the long run? We're going to shift to long run equilibrium, SRAS. 2, since that's a 1. It's going to go. Why? Because these resources are going to go and become cheaper. Now, is it realistic? Maybe, maybe not. For academic purposes, we're going to say that that would happen. So in the long run, the SRAS will always shift until they are at their long run equilibrium. We're just going to hold that to be true for the time being. So last thing is the LRAS can shift. Now, when can it shift? When the changes to ability to produce are seen as being permanent. So if resources become available, that can shift the LRAS. Let's think about it this way. If LRAS is the potential GDP, if I have 100 workers, a labor force of 100, and I have 5% natural rate of unemployment, that means I have 95 people working. So this is going to be the number of workers. I'm going to multiply by the productivity. Let's say it's 1. So there's a 95 output. What happens if the available resources increases to 200? Well, I still maintain a 5% unemployment rate, so now I'm going to have 190 workers. If they still have a productivity of 1, then they produced 190 units. They're still at full employment. They're still at their potential, but that has shifted over. What else can do that? Change the technology, change the productivity. If this productivity changes to 2 times because of whatever else, well, now they can produce twice as much, still at their full employment. Or policy incentives. Okay, the government's regulation can change. And if it's a permanent change, either increase or decrease, think taxes and available resources, that can shift it also. So again, today we talk about demand pull and cost push inflation, impacts on inflation, real GDP, unemployment rates, and we finished up with how the LRAS can shift. Hope that helped. Until next time.